guys, welcome. Thank you guys so much for being here. As Olivia mentioned, this is the 10th year of my life I've been devoting to this organization. I had 4 hours of sleep last night. Let's go. Okay. So this year, the lecture series every year, we come up with a theme and we send out an invitation to all of our many talented tour guides and lecturers. We have over 40 different tour guides and lecturers associated with our organization because Chicagoans love to tell other Chicagoans shit they know. And you could be one of those Chicagoans. January 31st, Tour Guide 101. Come on down, kids. You too can sit here and talk to a room full of people. But in all seriousness, every year we send out our theme. And this year we went with misconceptions, urban legends, and unfair stereotypes. Because Chicago and Chicagoans have had so many things said about them throughout all of history. And not all of those things are true, and a lot of those things aren't fair. So it felt like a great lecture topic, and myself, like probably many of you, the first thing you thought of when you thought of unfair reputations of Chicago, you probably thought about, the National Guard being in your hometown. So this is a relatively pertinent topic on this anniversary of sorts, January 6th. Let's talk about crime. But in all seriousness, this lecture series is about finding the truth in many, many lies and a lot of bias in media. That's what this lecture is about tonight, so it feels sort of on the nose. And I'm pretty excited to talk about it. Now, as a kind of quick disclaimer as we get into this, oh wait, I have a slide. I'll probably forget my slides, so look forward to that. Tonight's talk is about crime in Chicago, and spoiler alert for any of you that thought otherwise, you're going to find out that our city is not actually the crime-ridden hellhole that the media makes it out to be. And it certainly has been very terrible at times, but it really hasn't ever been more terrible than any other comparable American city. And that's where the part about the media really plays into this talk. So if you came here tonight hoping to hear all of the grisly details of Al Capone's many murders, I have bad news for you. There's far too many podcasts out there for me to compete. So we're going to talk generally about not just the crime, but the reputation of the crime and how the reputation of that crime feeds into this idea that Chicago is so wicked. But to make that point, I do have to tell you guys about a lot of really horrible things that happened both here and as a comparison point elsewhere. So the subject matter, this is your trigger warning. The subject matter we're going to discuss tonight is pretty dark. Often depressing, and if you think it's hard to hear, believe me, it was a crazy way to spend my Saturday night. But I find that most things that are hard are worth doing, and I believe extremely and founded this organization on the idea that information should be free and should be plentiful and should present history unvarnished, warts and all, because we really can't learn from the past unless we learn about the past. And I think in these times that make us feel so scared and powerless, it's important to take a moment and appreciate how far we've come. Because things really aren't that bad in Chicago, and at times it was much worse. I will try to use some humor to lighten the mood, but know that tonight my intent is not to leave you depressed, but to leave you validated, a little proud, and most importantly, informed, because information is power. Okay, so that brings me to my first slide here. This section, the wild Midwest. Hey guys, we're not all the way east and we're not all the way west. Shocking news from the front lines. Okay. So Chicago begins many years ago when indigenous people would use this land as a point of trade. Only the Europeans were stupid enough to build a city in a swamp, but this was an important site of trade for a long, long time. But in the 1780s, Jean-Baptiste Pontusable, who you may recognize from Lakeshore Drive, builds a farm at the mouth of the Great Chicago River. And in 1800, he sells his property to Jean Lalime, a Canadian fur trader. This is going to become important in a second here. Also in 1803, the United States purchases land they are not allowed to purchase from people that don't own it. Louisiana Purchase, 1803. All of the water that flows into the Mississippi River, as well as 6 square miles, loosely on the kind of southwestern edge of Lake Michigan. This was important because the Chicago River is a sort of continental divide between the Great Lakes system and the Mississippi River system. So they acquired in the Louisiana Purchase not just the Mississippi River basin, but also Chicago, very intentionally. We built Fort Dearborn to sort of keep an eye on things because this is the Wild West, y'all, and immediately start thinking about a canal to, again, connect these great waterways and make this a very important transportation city. Now, here's the thing. Oh, here's second Fort Dearborn, in case you want to see it. Okay, so we're going to talk about this guy very briefly because there's a much better lecture about John Kinsey available on our YouTube channel, Paul Daly, check it out, happened last year. But John Kinsey is responsible for the city's first murder, and this is a topic about crime. He purchases Jean Lalime's home, which was originally Jean-Baptiste Pontoussaint Lakeshore Drive's home, and he purchased... I'm too proud of myself for that joke. John Kinsey purchases Lalime/DuSable's house in 1802. The two of them are co-workers selling furs. And unfortunately, they get into a little bit of a feud. John Kinsey essentially bribes his way into a job being the exclusive seller of things to soldiers at the fort. In 1812, the conspiracy is discovered. Many people are pissed, including Jean Lalime, and John Kinsey ends up murdering him that same year, 1812. He flees. This is Jean Lalime on the right. As Paul says, we think. Regardless, he flees Chicago and ends up returning to Chicago in 1816 and lives here for 12 years as a respectable citizen, even serving as justice of the peace. So that's a good way to start Chicago's crime story. Now, these sorts of gunfights are not at all uncommon on the great American frontier. It's very important to realize that we are not the settled metropolises of England or Europe, and we're certainly not the, sort of less reputable but still sort of okay East Coast cities. Like, we out here, y'all. Here's how out here we are. The Erie Canal was built in 1825. It takes the amount of time it takes to get from New York City to Chicago in half, from 6 weeks to 3 weeks. And all of a sudden, you don't have to do it in a wagon with bumpy ass, no shocks, wooden wheels over the Appalachian fucking mountains. You can get yourself into a nice mule-pulled packet boat and take it through the Erie Canal. Shout out to the Erie Canal. Without it, we wouldn't have Chicago. And this is a big innovation. You have to keep in mind this is a very difficult journey, unforgiving natural terrain, severe weather, aggravated indigenous occupants of the land. The West tended to attract outlaws, transients, and single men. You know who you are. Many traumatized by war and death, just fighting PTSD from the Civil War, eventually the American Revolution, the War of 1812. They're fucked up and they're armed with increasingly more affordable firearms. Now, the Oregon Trail, this shit kicks off in 1836, which you probably don't remember from the computer game. And originally, it is only passable on foot or horseback, but in 1836, you start to see some wagons rolling down the Oregon Trail. Now, in 1848, the year Chicago gets its first railroad, we also discover gold in California. This sets off a tidal wave of mostly single male prospectors, the 1849ers, or the gold rush guys. They don't just come from the American East Coast. They also come from Australia, China, Britain, Mexico, Chile, all over the world. And obviously, when you put a bunch of single men with guns in a frontier town with no wives to keep them honest, and they're all from different backgrounds from all over the world, they go fight. And they did fight. During the first year of the gold rush, adding fuel to the fire, there are no courts, no police, and no prisons, so every miner tended to carry a pistol or a Bowie knife for protection. Men died by the thousands in brawls, mining disputes, bandit raids, formal duels, riots, and lynchings. And adults who lived in San Francisco, pictured on your left, an adult who lived in San Francisco in the period between California's statehood in 1850 and the end of the Civil War, 1865, faced about a 1 in 200 chance of being murdered. Between September of 1850 and 1851, the Pueblo of Los Angeles recorded an annual rate, and I've translated this because today we rate homicides by per capita. That's kind of the best way to kind of understand homicide as a number. It's amount of people killed per 100,000 people. Now, Los Angeles at this time only has 2,500 people, but their modern equivalent murder rate would be 1,240 homicides per 100,000 people. For comparison, today our rate's about 14.6. So suffice it to say, Los Angeles, 1851, bad place to be. Settlers heading out west in wagon trails would often carry, literally every single thing that they owned with them, making them an ideal target for bandits and outlaws and the Wild West. It's all true. For most outlaws, crime was petty, driven by drink, gold fever, and an absence of authority in women. Dramatically turns her pages. Okay, so the other thing that happens during the gold rush that deserves attention, all of the Europeans and people from all over the world arriving to California basically shoot, murder, kill, and lynch to get land from indigenous people that already lived there. So there's also a massacre on just regular people trying to live there. Community-led justice in frontier towns was key. Many communities adopted their sort of own codes of honor and methods of policing, which means citizens mobs. Everybody has guns. Let's just chase the guy out of town that we don't like, probably because of his color. Now, official law and order really struggled to keep up with how quickly the Wild West settled. And a really good example of an actually terrifying Dodge City, Kansas, very terrifying frontier town. Here it's pictured in 1875. Have you ever heard of the phrase, getting out of Dodge? I gotta get the hell out of Dodge. That's for Dodge City, Kansas. And it means, if you are not from America and perhaps don't understand our weird idioms, it means you're getting the fuck out of here because shit's dangerous. Founded in 1872 along a brand new set of railroad tracks, I gotta talk fast, I have so much to say. Okay. Founded in 1872 along railroad tracks, it was a cowboy town. It was a major point to ship buffalo hides, and there were a lot of gunfights. An adult who lived in Dodge City from 1876 to 1885 faced at least a 1 in 61 chance of being murdered, worse than San Francisco at the time. Getting out of Dodge. Oh, just kidding, I still need this page. Okay. All right, back to Chicago. And racists. Okay. There's a theme. Okay. Now, in Chicago, we elect our first constable in 1828, but our original lawmakers work part-time. They tend to manage traffic, look for fires, and, keep an eye on the drunks. And we were very still, the British rule during the American Revolution is still very present in the minds of people that live in Chicago at this point in time. And so many people feared tyrannical governments. They really believed in a light hand with policing. But that begins to change. By the end of the 1840s, observers both within the city and beyond it regularly noted the existence of an identifiable criminal underworld. In the words of the Chicago Democrat, a newspaper, it was getting to be a notorious fact that robbers, pickpockets, and thimble riggers are perfectly at home in our city. And in the 1850s, we also get the rise of the original Make America Great Party, the Know Nothing Party. They are nativists, despite being here typically for less than 50 years themselves. Maybe they came over on the Mayflower. These were immigrants against immigration. Here's the sign of their flag from the 1850s. Yeah, nothing happening to you today is new. They targeted immigrants, and to do so, they targeted one of the immigrants' favorite things, which in Chicago was beer. They sharply raised the price of saloon licenses and then demanded that taverns be closed on Sunday, leading to the Lager Beer Riot. Oh, here's the asshole that did it. That's Mayor Levi Boone. He's a real downer. Lager Beer Riot, April 21st of 1855. German immigrants, lovers of beer and political anarchy, and teamed up with the Irish, lovers of beer. to protest the recent arrest of 200 immigrants with these immigrant-targeted laws. And as they do, 200 of them gather. They start scaring police. They start throwing rocks at police. The police trap them on the Clark Street Bridge, pictured here, and then just shoot them. And this results in both Levi Boone being quickly ousted from the position of mayor. He served for a year. As well as a number of changes to the Chicago Police Department. All of a sudden, cops are salaried full-time officers patrolling day and night. They get uniforms in 1858, and all of a sudden, you know, this disorderly conduct issue does kind of have to be curbed a little bit. Now, it's important to realize that being a cop in Chicago in the 1850s is a little tricky. You don't have a car. So to arrest someone, you have to bring them down to the station however you can. This means you clobber the shit out of them with a club first. You put them in a wheelbarrow, perhaps. And all the while, their friends are trying to pull them from the wheelbarrow and take them from you because you don't have fingerprints or body cams. Anyway, it's wild. The homicide record in Chicago begins in 1870, and murder rates are actually relatively low. It's mostly just drunks being hauled to the station in wheelbarrows. Fun. Oh, here's some uniformed cops. Okay, let's talk about private police. Scotsman Alan Pinkerton is appointed Chicago's first detective in 1849 and quickly moves into the for-profit industry because it is never paid to work for the government. Post-fire, the Pinkertons are charged with enforcing martial law in Chicago. That's 1871 that the city burns down. And another kind of interesting fact about Pinkerton's start in Chicago is that he soon thereafter gets a job for the Illinois Central Railroad. One of his co-workers, the company's lawyer, is Abraham Lincoln. When Abraham Lincoln becomes president, he actually hires Pinkerton to serve as his private security, which I don't think Pinkerton wanted to brag about. Pause for laughter. But in the West, the Pinkertons are very successful in catching all of these outlaw gangs and trapping all these bandits and eventually breaking strikes. In the late 1860s, many, I don't want to show this map yet. Wait, hold on. There we go. Okay. In the 1860s, the United States builds a ton of railroads. Very specifically, Chicago builds a bunch of railroads that connect to Chicago and everywhere else. As you can see, when you look at a railroad map of the United States, kind of Chicago's at the hub, and that is a reason we kind of collected all the great agriculture and livestock of the West and then funneled them on trains to the East Coast and all of our developed cities. So we've always been this sort of cornerstone, this important part in the middle of the country between those yeehaws out West and the like snobs out East. We've always been sort of stuck in the middle. That's nothing new. Migration goes up enormously with railroads. All of a sudden, you have women and families coming with their men to the West, so things get safer. Funny how that works. Policing becomes more professional as we sort of coalesce into shapes that look like states you know. A lot of deputy U.S. marshals start sort of rounding up the outlaws on the frontier and securing the old territories as the families start to come. Around the same time, we also have not this one yet. We also have the Great Wave of immigration. So in the late 1800s, you have a massive amount of immigrants arriving to the United States and then moving here to Chicago because of all of our great jobs in transportation and slaughterhouses and other such things. By 1890, 79% of Chicago is foreign-born, largely German, Irish, Scandinavian, Czech, Greek, Italian, and Russian. Here's where I talk a little shit about New York. Won't be the first time. New York City establishes their police department in 1845. By the 1850s, it is the most notorious city in the United States for crime. But that's just kind of big city things. It's not just them. It's not just us. It just turns out when you put a shitload of people from all over the world in the same cramped tenements and make them work 12 hours a day for like $1 a day, they're going to fight. Who would have known? Couldn't see that coming. If you've ever seen the Martin Scorsese film Gangs of New York, that's New York around this time. If you haven't seen it, it's a historical film. Go watch it. And in a lot of ways, Little Five Points in New York is dominated by rival Irish gangs, the Irish Catholics versus the Irish Protestants. We had Irish gangs too, but New York got a whole movie made about them. What can I say? We got plenty of movies later. Wait till the 30s. All right. Let's talk about Vice, y'all. My best review online is a woman's 2-star review of my tour where she said I was too opinionated about prostitutes and Al Capone. So if you're here, Nancy, just leave. Sorry, Nance. At our heart, we're still a frontier town. We're not as polished as our eastern peers, and we're, kind of not as wild as our Wild West friends. But Vice starts to concentrate in Chicago in an area known as the Patches, pre-fire. The Tribune described it as a place of the most beastly sensuality and darkest crimes. Many people saw the fire of 1871 as divine retribution. Lawlessness after the fire, aka why they hired the Pinkertons, gave no cause for optimism. The city, one newspaper reported, is infested with hordes of thieves, burglars, and cutthroats bent on plunder who will not hesitate to burn, pillage, and even murder. So the Levee District starts to coalesce after the Great Chicago Fire, grows to eventually encompass an area bounded by, and I'll say it slow, Van Buren to Cermak, State Street to the river. Big-ass area. Its peak is from the 1880s to the 1912s, and it becomes known as the Levee due to its proximity to the wharves. By 1893, there are an estimated 37 brothels, 46 bars, 11 pawn shops, and an estimated 1,300 working girls. One of the bawdiest red light districts in all of America. It ranged from ultra-seedy panel houses along Bedbug Row, where you were likely to get robbed by the likes of Mary Hastings, or all the way up to the notorious Everly Club, where clients spent an average of $200 to $1,000 per visit in an era where $6 was the average pay for an entire week of work. Oh yeah, we had nice brothels. King Henry of Prussia, proud customer. Well publicized as well, leading to our, here's some funny ones. Hundreds of children must walk daily through this infernal region. Chicago by day and night, seen to the right in its more original publishing, was a guidebook to Chicago published for visitors to the 1893 World's Fair, offering tourists tips on where to find lurid entertainment. Hell yeah. It had a companion book by day. We also get William T. Steed's famous If Christ Came to Chicago in 1894, painting Chicago as a town of modern corruption. We get Detective Clifton Woolridge's Hands Up, a 1901 book that was a popular account detailing the many arrests he made at the World's Fair. People have always loved true crime, even before podcasts. As well as Assistant Attorney General Clifford Rowe's media-savvy campaign against white slavery, a.k.a. kidnapping girls at Dearborn Station and forcing them into prostitution. By publishing The Social Evil in Chicago in 1911, putting the city at the center of a prostitution scandal in the United States. So white slavery, about that. That's, again, where you kidnap this poor, innocent farm girl from Nebraska at Dearborn Station and you force her to work in a house of sin. It did happen, just kind of like not, I think, as much as people reported it happening. But this did lead to organizations like the Women Christian Temperance Union. Great talk about them, given by Olivia a couple years ago, also on our YouTube. Led to widespread awareness about the dangers of alcohol abuse and this issue happening to women. So the district is mostly shut down in 1911, mostly at once, by Mayor Carter Henry Harrison Jr.'s Vice Commission. But we are hardly alone. We are certainly not the only frontier town or big city in America that has a vice district. You have San Francisco's Barbary Coast. You have Philadelphia's Tenderloin, great name for a vice district. And New Orleans' Storyville, who also becomes famous for their actually regulated prostitution. Hilariously, there is a section of Chicago's Vice District called Little Cheyenne, as a reference to the sort of lawlessness of the Wild West, described by one Chicago detective as about as tough and vicious a place as there was on the face of the earth. Residents of Cheyenne, Wyoming, then named their own red light district Little Chicago. I can't make this up. I even fact-checked that one. Crimes of the century. Here's the thing. Now you've got your background. You've got your primer. We're the Wild West, and we're also all the big city problems of the East all rolled into one. We really didn't have a fair shake of it at any point. But additionally, newspaper reporting is a big old thing. And Chicago publishes a lot of newspapers, and our stories are widely copied all over the country. And we're going to talk about that. And part of the reason our crime is so well known is that we wouldn't stop talking about it. Crimes of the century. So crimes of the century, actually, crime of the century, there have been more crimes per century than any of these reporters could have dreamed of. Here's a selection of crimes of the century I found. My favorite is the delegitimizing of silver. People called everything and anything a crime of the century, so don't really take that when you see it. Like, take it with a grain of salt. You can read. There's some other gems in there. Treatment of women, treatment of black people, just one man being upset. Anything could be a crime of the century. Now, crime rates are always higher in cities, and when your city talks a lot about it, you're going to all of a sudden have a lot of people paying attention to all your crimes of the century. Founded in 1847, the Chicago Daily Tribune becomes one of the leading voices of the new Republican Party in the era of Lincoln. Daily circulation of about 40,000 during the Civil War, which was very high at the time. The Chicago Daily News is the people's paper. It's the city's first penny paper, meaning it's a little shittier but cheap. It's the Spirit Airlines of newspapers. And this is founded by someone who becomes very important in 1875, Melville H. Stone. By the late 1880s, the Chicago Daily News, blowing the Tribune out of the water, has an average circulation of 200,000 copies per day, making it one of the most widely read newspapers in the world. Pays to give information away cheaply, am I right? Nervous laughter as you all realize you didn't buy a ticket to get here. Anywho, the Chicago Daily News is a smashing success, and Melville H. Stone is also an important man because the telegraph, invented in 1844, quickly links all major cities and revolutionizes the practice of news. All of a sudden, you didn't just have to send reporters all over the country to get the scoop. You didn't have to pay all of your reporters in general. You could subscribe to a wire service like the Associated Press, or AP, which is established in 1846, and they will theoretically send you very neutral news that you can spin however you like in your own paper for your own readers. Melville Stone served as the manager of the Associated Press from 1893 to 1921 and revolutionized how we share, spread, and distribute news in the United States. But it ain't just white papers, y'all. Robert Abbott publishes the first issue of the Chicago Defender on May 6th of 1905. What started as a 4-page handbill becomes the most important black newspaper in America. I would argue one of the most important newspapers in America. While the English, you can see the kind of distribution of the Chicago Defender. Many Chicago-based Pullman porters carried copies of it with them on train lines, and it enjoyed substantial distribution as a result. Additionally, there are many foreign language papers that are published here in Chicago. Practically every immigrant group you can think of had at least one newspaper written in their own language as well. Now, what are you going to do with all that access to information? How about some stories of serial killers? This is Herman Webster Mudgett, and if my name was Herman Webster Mudgett, I'd rename myself H.H. Holmes as well. He is often erroneously described as the nation's first serial killer. He wasn't, but his antics and crimes did certainly generate a lot of widespread news. I'd like to give a special shout out to Adam Seltzer, preeminent H.H. Holmes scholar of this room, for saving me for saving me a lot of time researching, because I was like, yo, Adam, this true? So police don't really use the term serial killers in the time that H.H. Holmes is practicing. Serial killer is a 1970s term, and some people, Adam, argue he wasn't even a serial killer because he wasn't like some crazed sicko that was like having weird fantasies. He mostly was a con man. He arrives in Chicago in 1886, begins construction on his infamous Inglewood murder castle about a year later. He never finished it because he scammed literally everyone that was building it for him. He killed somewhere between 9 and 27 people, mostly women he was dating, people he hoped to profit off of, and to hide evidence of his other crimes. So, he's not quite the same type of sicko that like Jeffrey Dahmer was, you know what I mean? The 70s would say so. One of his partners in crime was a man named Benjamin Peitzel. In many cons and schemes they organized all across the country to make money. In 1894, they concoct a scheme to fake Peitzel's death for insurance money. In Philadelphia, so the crime does not even occur in the city of Chicago, he actually, instead of faking Peitzel's death, just kills him. And then he claims the insurance money. He entangles Peitzel's family. He gets the wife to sign over a couple of the children to him. It becomes this really big, messy thing. Pinkertons track him to Boston, where he's arrested, and he's sentenced to death in Philadelphia and hanged in 1896. Now, the Tribune first mentions H.H. Holmes in May of 1893, but only in references pretty much to his scamming of every single furniture dealer in town. When the Peitzel scheme is kind of unraveled in 1894, more newspapers ran the story, and by 1895, when the bodies of the two children are found, the press had a field day, absolutely sensationalizing the hell out of this story from coast to coast. I have put on all my slides where the newspaper comes from, so you can understand what people in the Dakotas or Detroit or New York State are reading about H.H. Holmes and various other news articles we're going to talk about today. So the thing is, yellow journalism is not new, and they made up all kinds of crazy shit about H.H. Holmes. His unfinished building, did not have, a million crazy death chambers and everything. That's just, a way to sell newspapers, and literally all of you fell for it. And it is made worse by this nationwide coverage, because all of a sudden you have, mechanics in Ohio popping up and being like, oh, yeah, I helped build that building. It was suspicious. And, it gets kind of crazy. But again, just look at the spread of his crimes. He has horse scams in Texas, Boston, Philadelphia, in Toronto. He is scamming all over the place. So newspapers and police are interested in following this case all throughout the country. But that's not the only crime of the century that we got. Wait, this is too early. Sorry, don't look. Okay. Again, H.H. Holmes was not the first American serial killer, not at all. That maybe goes to a couple of different people, perhaps the Harp brothers practicing in, I gotta stop saying practicing. The Harp brothers murdering in the 1790s. They were British loyalists. They terrorized the frontier, committing nearly 30 murders all across the United States. You have the Bloody Benders of the 1870s, a family of killers that preyed on travelers passing through their roadside Kansas ranch. So H.H. Holmes didn't even invent that. Holmes was not even Chicago's first serial killer. That honor could belong to a couple of different people. Just ask Adam later. Maybe belongs to Thomas Neal Cream, who poisoned mostly sex workers in the Levee district around the 1880s to 1881. Media makes a huge impact. Another murderer very active at the same time as H.H. Holmes is the servant girl annihilator. One guess what he did. Practicing in Austin, Texas in the 1880s, he targeted mostly black servant women, so the media didn't even really begin reporting on it until he murdered 2 white ladies, and they still never caught him because the cops were too busy arresting black people, despite multiple living witnesses being like, no, he was white. So H.H. Holmes partially gets caught because he murders white girls, and he also gets caught just because of the amount of media attention on this case and the amount of law personnel that are involved. John Wayne Gacy and the Chicago Strangler, look it up, aside, most serial killers hail from New York, California, and Texas. New York tops the list with 18 recorded serial killers. Most serial killer cases are, of course, are recorded in cities. We've had quite a few, but by no means an unusual amount. That would New York, that would be New York, or California, or Texas. Leopold and Loam, a crime of a century. Dude, seriously. So were silver prices. Okay. 1924, May 21st of 1924, 14-year-old Bobby Franks is kidnapped and killed by 18-year-old Richard Loeb and 19-year-old Nathan Leopold in Chicago's Hyde Park neighborhood. It is remembered as a crime of the century because people were, again, shocked at this point that white dudes could be killing. Leopold and Loeb were from wealthy Jewish society families and students of prestigious universities. They did not fit what people envisioned as like serial killers or killers at this point in history. And that is part of what really captivated people in this case. They had a homoerotic friendship. Ooh. Marked by fantasies, delusions of grandeur, elaborate games, and they committed several crimes together, mostly stealing beforehand. They thought themselves so smart. They were like the original Reddit neckbeards. They thought they were so smart that they could commit the perfect motive-free crime that would stump police and allow them to capture all this media attention, collect a large ransom, and basically prove they were smarter than everybody else. Ironically, the way mostly that they got caught is because Leopold dropped his super Nepo baby rich boy glasses at the crime scene, and they were like, only 3 people have ever bought these, and then he just like immediately confessed, basically. Now, the thing I want to point out about this slide as well, the Chicago Daily Journal is simultaneously reporting, at first they thought a moron killed the boy. It's fucked up. But this newspaper is simultaneously reporting on self-defense in Ballula's plan. That is a reference to the woman whose shooting of her husband would go on to inspire another reason people associate us with crime, the play Chicago. We keep doing it to ourselves. I don't know if we wrote that one. Anyway. Regardless, Leopold and Loeb make a number of mistakes. Amongst them, on University of Chicago campus, Loeb is there a couple days after the murder. He runs into several reporters, and one remembers him saying, if I was going to murder anybody, I would murder just such a cocky little son of a bitch as Bobby Franks. Way to incriminate yourself, genius! Media coverage was instantaneous. People were fascinated. They were all competing for the scoop, reporting every twist, every turn, official and unofficial comment, rumor, speculation, even the boys' confessions. It is front page news in Boston, New York, Pennsylvania, Halifax, Canada, San Francisco, and Alaska. Alvin Goldstein and James Mulroy later win the 1925 Pulitzer Prize for helping report and opening this case to some degree because they found, they kind of led investigators to evidence that the typewriter that they found in a pond belonged to Nathan Leopold. So the newspapers sort of help in some ways. Clarence Darrow is their very expensive Nepo baby defense lawyer. And he focuses the entire case on basically saving the boys from the death penalty. So it's also almost equally remembered by lawyers as this like incredible case campaigning against the death penalty far before it was cool. So that also generates a lot of media coverage. Here's a few examples. As you can see, literally everybody was reporting on this. Reporting from Alaska. But now we're going to switch into the part where we're not talking about murderers anymore. We're going to talk about a couple of victims because victims often generate a lot of news media coverage as well. Starting with the Grimes sisters in 1956. This one's bleak, y'all. 13-year-old and 15-year-old Patricia and Barbara Grimes disappear on December 28th of 1956, spurring a national news coverage. If you've come on our McKinley Park tour, you've probably heard this story. They are leaving their house on a Friday night to go see the Elvis movie Love Me Tender. They miss curfew at 11:45 p.m. and are reported missing later the same day. A huge search kicks off. Again, missing white girls, always great news. Flyers are distributed, sightings are reported all over town, and it is front page news in multiple cities by New Year's Eve. Over 300,000 people are questioned, and so, this is the crazy thing for me, so intense and all-consuming is Elvis mania at this point that it is initially thought by even investigators that maybe they had simply just run away, possibly to Nashville, to see Elvis Presley in concert or just to emulate his lifestyle. This is seen as such a valid possibility that a televised public statement from Presley's estate is issued on January 19th saying, if you are good Presley fans, you'll go home and ease your mother's worries. Elvis himself does a radio spot. Their bodies, unfortunately, are found January 22nd, naked and frozen in a ditch without obvious cause of death, with decay paused in its track by the winter weather. There's several suspects, but ultimately this case to this day is still unsolved. It received coverage from Miami to California in large cities and in small towns. Many parts of the story, again, distributed by the Associated Press, which had a number of important people here in Chicago contributing stories to them. This would be the modern equivalent of like a Taylor Swift fan going missing and Taylor Swift being like, hey girl, stop trying to come to New York. Crazy. Okay, this one is not going to immediately strike you as a story about Chicago crime, and that's because this case did not take place in Chicago. But I actually find this to be a fascinating example of bias in media, because this story is part of the reason the South is afraid of us, as they should be. Emmett Till is a 14-year-old black boy in 1955 who visits his family in Mississippi. He pops into a grocery store owned by a couple of racists, Carolyn and Roy Bryant. They claim he makes a pass at Carolyn. This is disputed. The couple then finds out where he's staying, kidnaps him, beats his face into an unrecognizable bloody pulp, shoots him, and dumps his body into the river for no other reason than just being black while shopping. Emmett's mother, Mamie, has his body sent back to Chicago and demands an open casket funeral to show people her son's mutilated body. It is 1955, and we think that we've figured out the race problem. Mamie Till, she don't agree. His funeral draws massive crowds in the city of Chicago. Photographs of Till's body are published in black newspapers around the country, not any white ones. Reports even make the United Kingdom papers. The NAACP gives interviews, calls it a lynching, which it was, and bolstered by black publications, many based in Chicago, like the Chicago Defender and Jet magazine. It spurs public outrage at the treatment of blacks in the American South. Historians have referred to this trial specifically as the first great media event of the civil rights movement. Now, at first, Mississippi residents, politicians, and papers condemn the killer's actions and call for justice. But as the case starts to draw a lot of attention and a lot of heat and a lot of reporting, and Northerners start giving comment, the NAACP starts giving comment, the city of Chicago mayor and the Illinois governor start calling for justice in Mississippi, the Mississippi papers get defensive. And this is the fucked up part. There's a lot of fucked up parts. But they publish photos of the killers in military dress. They describe Carolyn as young and attractive. They soften in describing the brutalness of the killer and distance the entire situation from conversations about race, basically being like, it was just a couple of bad actors. That's not us. The sheriff goes on record saying that the NAACP probably made it all up, and that body he found probably wasn't even Emmett Till. He fucking just flip-flops 180 degrees because he's trying to stay in his elected official position. And papers begin to editorialize what happens at the Chicago funeral. I included not a picture of Emmett Till's bloody face. You can Google it. It's fucked up. But these are photos of Emmett Till's funeral. As you will notice, it is not a riot. It's just a lot of people at a funeral in a very important civil rights case. The thing is, I'll just read you a quote. When the Clarksdale Press Register noted simply that the large crowd caused a front window to be broken, this is not necessarily the case with some of their rival papers. Readers of the Jackson Daily News or the Meridian Star would have read about how the press was so great that practically every window was shattered and the chapel was left in shambles. It insinuated in the paper that violence was on its way to Mississippi in the form of buses filled with liberals and black people, and they were going to come get ya in Mississippi. This is terrifying for the average Mississippi paper reader. Even if you have no original thought about this case, you read this type of thing and go, holy shit, Chicago is a dangerous place full of people that believe passionately and differently from me, and they're going to come on a bus and come get me for something that crazy weirdo down the street did that I didn't even do. It's almost like they were scared of someone coming to their home, kidnapping them, and killing them. And somehow, they blamed us for it in their irresponsible media gaslighting. We really didn't deserve to catch strays for Emmett Till's death because, again, it happened in Mississippi and was conducted by a bunch of Southern racists. But so offended and defensive are the Mississippi papers that they start publishing alongside news reports of Emmett Till's death, as it is in Chicago. They start publishing our prime and say things like rape and murder are common crimes in Chicago. So they literally start painting Chicago as this violent place to live with people that are so different from you. What the fuck? All right, that one's rough. As you can imagine, the killers are acquitted. It's just such an interesting case because it is an example of a crime that did not happen in Chicago that had an effect on what other people saw our city as that would reverberate for generations and contextualize some of the civil rights demonstrations that we're going to talk about later in this presentation. Now, these exhaustively covered murder cases are not unusual elsewhere in America, nor are trials that touch on race and immigrant tensions. 50 years before, in 1906, Stanford White's questionable relationship that ends up with him getting murdered in Madison Square Garden is dubbed crime of the century. In 1931, the Scottsboro boys, 9 young men ages 12 to 19, are falsely accused of raping 2 young white women while traveling through Alabama and serve years in prison. In 1935, you may remember the Lindbergh baby is kidnapped. In New Jersey, a German immigrant is found guilty and dies by electric chair. And I wish that I could say that Emmett Till was the last lynching victim, but a 12-person white mob attacks 3 black subway employees, killing Willie Turks in Brooklyn, New York in 1982. Go ahead and raise your hand if you were born before 1982. There you go. Cool. I'm going to have a little sip of my drink. Gangsters and politicians. Now, here's the thing. Corruption in Chicago is a little bit by design. In 1907, the average police officer on beat makes 30 arrests a year. Roughly half are for disorderly conduct, drunkenness, and vagrancy. In an effort to combat drinking-related crime and the need for more police officers to put those drunk people in wheelbarrows and haul them down to the station, saloon licensing fees are sharply raised between 1883 and 1906. Now, so few businessmen could afford these new increased fees that breweries like Schlitz start buying out these tavern owners. All of a sudden, you're not an entrepreneur, you're an employee. And maybe you're looking for a little bit of side cash because you don't even own the joints anymore. So maybe you let a little gambling happen, or you turn a blind eye to a little bit of prostitution happening over there in the corner. Ironically, the need for protection from additional legislation and police looking too closely actually turned some saloon owners into politicians themselves. The most famous of them are someone called Chicago. It's Not just the most corrupt city in America, it's the most theatrically corrupt. Michael Hinky Kenna and Bathhouse John Coughlin are the most theatrically corrupt aldermen I would say that we've ever had. They're kind of fun. Lightening the mood with a little Hinky Dink Kenna and Bathhouse John. So Hinky Dink Kenna runs a bar called the Working Man's Exchange. It's the building's still there. A pawn shop's in it. It's right across from that triangle-shaped jail downtown. Go look at it. Right underneath the Ewing Annex Hotel, one of our city's last remaining single-room occupancy hotels, which are a critical source of keeping people from living on the streets. Go check it out. It's history, y'all, happening right there on Clark Street, unchanged since about 1895. That is where Hinky Dink Kenna's Working Man's Exchange was, and the name of the bar is intentional because Hinky Dink Kenna, he's going to give you a beer, he's going to give you lunch, and you're going to remember who gave you that beer and that lunch on voting day. And you're going to vote early, and you're going to... Good job, class. You guys did that so well. This is why I can't lecture to tourists. So the other way that Hinky Dink Kenna and Bathhouse John stay in power, besides, just this sort of thing, they also have a corrupt political fundraiser you can learn about by watching Layla Royale's lecture on our YouTube channel from last year on the first word ball. They throw an annual political fundraiser every single year, and they basically force you to come if you live in the Vice District and work in the Vice District and run a business in the Vice District. You have to come, and if you don't come, police are going to come raid your joint. And if you do come, then the police won't look at whatever illegal shit you have going on in the Vice District. They serve for an incredibly long amount of time supervising Chicago's first ward. Now, the interesting thing about policing in Chicago at the turn of the century when this is occurring is that, police headquarters set the standards and tell you what uniform to buy, but the real power in policing is the neighborhood precinct captain. That guy is in charge with enforcing the laws that headquarters decides on, and the precinct captain in the first ward is New York gangster Big Jim Calissimo. He don't care if you're operating a brothel. Tell you what, Big Jim Calissimo is going to become quite important because moving into the 1920s, the Vice District dissipates. It doesn't go away. They shut down the Vice District in 1911, but it never goes away. And it also gets sadder because the Vice District, for all of its flaws and all of its evil women, Madam Mary Hastings, the Vice District brothels are largely by women, for women. No. Madams are women. They're madams. Pimps are men, and they'll beat the shit out of you. Well, so will Madam Mary Hastings. But it does get worse for women as we move into the 1920s type of prostitution as well. And this is all made possible because all of a sudden you have the telephone and you have cars and you can do quiet solicitation in the back of an existing saloon instead of having to set up shop and have your ladies flash their skirts up to their nipples in an alley in the Vice District. You can do it a little bit more covertly. Now, additionally, Prohibition kills the saloon, obviously, in 1920, but over 3,000 illegal speakeasies are throughout the city. It's hard to say how many because they didn't advertise themselves that well. And again, these are tavern owners that already got stripped of entrepreneurship and made to be employees, so they've already been turning a blind eye to crime. Now they're running illegal drinking establishments, so it's like, what are you going to do? Call the cops because something bad happened in your bar? Your bar's illegal. So this complicates things. Additionally, we have Mayor Big Bill Thompson, who serves from 1915 to 1923 and from 1927 to 1931, almost entirely overlapping the dominance of Al Capone. Mayor Big Bill Thompson, he don't give a fuck whatever illegal shit you're getting up to. And the city isn't open and rampant with bootlegging and vice during his tenure. Police are functionally completely incapable of prosecuting any of these gangland murders because the corruption runs all the way to the top. Here's Big Bill Thompson. On the bright side, the union supported him. More on that later. This kicks off the beer wars. So, in 1920, the same year Prohibition begins, Big Jim Calissimo is murdered, and New Yorkers, that's right, New Yorkers, send us Al Capone? New New Yorkers send us two guys. They send us Johnny the Fox Torrio and his protege, Al Capone, who eventually take over the gang that becomes known as the Chicago Outfit. Now, Chicago was selected as a really good place to have a strong organized crime syndicate because, unlike New York, it connects to both the Great Lakes system, the Mississippi River system, and pretty much every single rail system all throughout the country. And across those Great Lakes, what can you get from Canada? Alcohol. So it's a very convenient place to have a large bootlegging operation. The Outfit is a South Side gang, contrary to what every single person on the North Side will tell you about where their grandma's house. More on that at Adam's lecture. Suffice it to say, no, Capone was mostly on the South and a little bit in Cicero, so no, that place around the corner from you that advertises an Airbnb that Capone slept there once is lying. Spoiler alert. Anywho, the North Side gang are their major rivals. You can see this gang map here. There's a lot of different gangs, but the kind of major rival of Capone's Chicago Outfit is the North Side gang, cleverly named, on the North Side. Now, Torrio and Capone are pretty effective leaders. They manage 500 gang members at its group height. Now, Torrio goes back to New York City, confident in his protege's abilities, in 1925, and Al Capone is a disgusting fucking pig, and that's when things start to get very violent and gross. I did warn you about what Nancy said. Now, most gangsters, you try to do your crime on the low, right? Like, you don't want people knowing that you're a gangster. Al Capone, according to an FBI special agent, really appeared to be an individual who wanted all the glitz and glamour of media attention, but not necessarily the consequences that would later come from that. He was known for being flamboyantly dressed in brightly colored suits and his trademark hat. He gave interviews to newspapers and was often photographed as a man about town. This is ideal for newspaper reporters that are trying to sell papers because, holy shit, you can just interview the gangster that's like terrorizing your city. You can take pictures of him. He's at a, baseball game. He's easy to track down. So this is a bad idea for Al Capone, but awesome for newspaper reporters. He is world famous in the time that he is living in the 1920s. That's not something that comes later with the Hollywood gangster films of the 30s. In his day, people knew him both for the pictures of him, the reporting, the interviews, and also his dramatic shootouts. Now, the thing is, Al Capone, obviously, I selected these news articles carefully. Go to hell, he bellows at reporters. He did eventually get tired of the media attention after bringing it upon himself. But his notoriety really takes a hit when he is implicated in the organization of several different violent episodes. Please enjoy my glitter word art. Yeah, stop getting tattoos of Al Capone. Y'all think I'm kidding. So 1924, the Chicago Outfit, led by Al Capone, shoots Northside gang leader Dion O'Banion in his flower shop. In 1926, they machine gun his successor, Jaime Weiss, on the steps of the Holy Name Cathedral of a church, y'all. And in 1929 comes the Valentine's Day Massacre, which I did picture here because this is not an innocent boy that got beaten to a pulp. This is a horrible and despicable act by a white guy that people keep getting tattoos of. He is not cool. How many times do I have to say it? Al Capone is not cool just because he dressed well. And the pictures are in black and white, so you don't even know if he did dress well. Posing as police officers, his men enter a storage warehouse controlled by the Northside gang, line up 7 guys on a wall, and open fire with machine guns. Law enforcement have no ability to prosecute Capone for this. He's in Miami at the time. No one is tried for these killings, and he gets away with it. However, this does sort of generate some attention on the brutality of his crimes. Public opinion starts to turn on him. He's arrested in Philadelphia in 1929 for carrying a concealed weapon and sentenced to a very cushy year in prison at the Eastern State Penitentiary. If you ever go to Pennsylvania and you go to Philadelphia, go tour the Eastern State Penitentiary. It's a very interesting museum, and you can see the little cozy setup Al Capone bribed his way into while he was there for a year. year. When he's released, we get the first ever list of public enemies, invented here in Chicago by the Chicago Crime Commission. When Al Capone is released from his Philadelphia hotel stay, he is placed at #1, public enemy #1 by the Chicago Crime Commission. President Herbert Hoover runs on a platform of anti-crime, and he does try to do some amount of redeeming of his public reputation. He opens a Depression-era soup kitchen in the 1930s, although no one ever saw him in it. As Mary Borden noted, for Al Capone is an ambidextrous giant. He kills with one hand and feeds with the other. He also stole the food he was selling and giving away in his soup kitchen. And don't be like, oh, Robin Hood. No, he was like being like, give me your bread or I'll fuck you up. From like innocent, people that were running bread shops. Not a good guy. Federal authorities become intent on jailing Capone. They catch him for tax evasion and jail him in 1931. He lost his mind in prison from long-term untreated syphilis and died in 1947. Stop getting tattoos of Al Capone. He died of syphilis. Raise your hand if you have a tattoo of someone that died of syphilis. During the 1995 demolition of beautiful former National Historic Landmark, the Lexington Hotel, built 1895, during the 1995 demolition of Al Capone's final lair, this innocent hotel he ruined, Crime Commission President Donald Mulak remarked, "Perhaps at last we can put to rest any misplaced nostalgia for the violence, crime, and corruption of the past and bury that image of Chicago once and for all." Well said, President Donald Mulak. We have not succeeded. But we're not the only city struggling with this as well. Again, we're not the only ones. That's the chorus that we're going to get to eventually toward the end here. I promise I will end my talk eventually. I have so much to say. So during Prohibition, a lot of these gangs started all of a sudden having this incredible opportunity to make money in rum running and bootlegging and selling alcohol. So a lot of kind of like fragmented immigrant street gangs become very well funded. And that is a huge part of the crime wave of Prohibition, not just in Chicago, but in New York and Boston. Young immigrants from Italy and Ireland and from Jewish communities are not able to necessarily find legitimate employment because of discrimination, and so they turn to gangs. And we also have a number of weapon improvements, like the Chicago Pineapple, that's a grenade, or the Chicago Typewriter, that's a machine gun. So things are just more deadly. And these are some examples here for you of shit happening in New York. Innocent bystanders being killed there as well. But even during Prohibition, Chicago's levels of violence and vice were not especially bad. The most interesting thing that I learned while I was researching, one of the most interesting things I learned while researching this talk is that Chicago's crime in the 1920s is a very small drop in the bucket for what crime was in Chicago in the 1980s and 1990s. We think of the mobsters as this horrific time in Chicago history, and in a lot of ways it was much more blatant and protected by the political powers that be, but it was much, much, much less than it was in recent history around times that many of us in this room were alive for and remember. Chicago's homicide rate in 1930 was about 14.4 per 100,000 people. That's very similar to actually what it is today. The same year, two of the country's largest cities, Cleveland and St. Louis, 1930, reported rates closer to 17, while 30 smaller cities reported numbers between 20 and 58. Memphis took the #1 spot. We had the most murders, but that's the problem. Newspaper reporters cherry-picking news like to report the number of murders we've had in Chicago, which is often doesn't look great. The thing is, by population, we're actually middle of the pack. Yay. gangsters to mobsters and unions. That's the title of this section. Over the next decade, the outfit professionalizes and quiets down, as you can learn all about from Giovina. Check our YouTube. Gang-related crime drops citywide, said Tribune reporters in 1959. The old Capone syndicate operates today on a larger scale than the hoodlums of the Prohibition era ever could have dreamed of. Efficiently and businesslike, more quietly and far more powerfully. Capone was a vicious, pig-brained slob, but he has become a storied footnote of America, almost with a touch of nostalgia for the exciting and colorful days of the gang wars in the 1920s. Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo are the top bosses of the Chicago outfit from the 1940s almost all the way up until Accardo's death in 1992. They let younger guys kind of run the thing, but the gangsters of this era practice all the same liquor-related sins of their fathers, but they also grow rich by selling narcotics to young people, by muscling in on labor unions, and by powerful alliances with crooked politicians in both parties. They own hotels, motels, nightclubs, racehorses, gambling casinos, handbooks, and brothels. Largely, they also keep quiet because actually, as a gangster, the best thing that you can do is not tell people you're a gangster. They reached the height of their power in the 1960s. Over this sort of mid-century period, they are accused and often convicted for extorting Hollywood, running casino scams with Teamster pension funds. If you just want to get a TLDR about this period, you can also watch Martin Scorsese's Casino. Martin Scorsese makes a lot of great historical fiction for me to reference. By the 1970s and 80s, the outfit is honestly out. Like the infiltration of police and federal agents into the organization have really kind of turned it around, and additionally, it just stops being profitable. There's also a number of changes in law enforcement. You get more federal agents after Prohibition, and very importantly, you also get, oh, here you go, crime. Happened everywhere. Okay. You also get this guy, Orlando Wilson, superintendent of Chicago police from 1960 to 1967. Would have been fucking great if he'd lasted one more year. I'll tell you why. Orlando Wilson is a pretty good guy. He redraws police district boundaries without regards to politics. He increases hiring standards, curbs graft, improves technology, and tightens discipline for police officers. Morale and public image of the police rose significantly during this time. He also notably improves police relations with the black community. He recruits more black officers. He promotes black sergeants. And insists on police restraint in racially charged conflicts. Unfortunately, he retires in 1967. Mayor Daley, almost immediately after, comments in April 1968 that police should shoot to kill rioters. So 1968 is going to be a dark year. We're going to get to that. Okay, this is part 4 of 4. I'm going to speed through it. All right. Here's the thing. Rich people run newspapers. Newspapers do not like to report on poor people being angry at rich people. All right, you can go home now. Remarked David McCrae, a Scottish visitor in 1870, what Chicago does, she does with all her might. Her good people are very good. Her bad people are very bad. Everything works at high pressure. The first thing that strikes a stranger is the universal rush for wealth. We were a boom town, a canal town, a speculative town in the 1830s from the very beginning. And this rush for wealth creates very deplorable conditions for the average American workers because people realize that efficiency is the name of the game. And rather than spending a lot of money on a skilled butcher, you can teach 4 illiterate immigrants how to do one part of the cow disassembly process and then process way more cows in a way shorter period of time and spend way less money. As industrialization grows, labor abuses in America run rampant, and there are strikes all over because the economy is terrible and labor conditions are terrible. Gilded Age inequity. You want to know what's fun about this graph? The Gilded Age feels so long ago. 1880s, 1890s, George Pullman. Ooh, excesses of the Victorian era. Oh, those poor factory workers. Guess what, kids? We are at levels of wealth disparity between the top 1% and the bottom 99%, unseen since the era of the Gilded Age. Woo! I don't know how to make that less depressing. Cool. Moving on. Here's a chart. It's getting late in the talk for charts. Here's what the chart tells you. It tells you that negative press hurts strikes. Negative press is put out by newspapers that are run by rich people. Newspapers struggle to report on strikes and protests against labor and working conditions because newspapers themselves are capitalist enterprises. A newspaper is run typically by a rich oil magnate. Look at any newspaper today. And newspapers had, especially in the late 1800s, a number of strikes affecting their own production. There were a series of newsboy strikes in the late 1800s in Chicago and New York, protesting the very conditions of making and distributing a paper itself. So obviously, newspapers are going to report in a very biased manner when it comes to reporting labor uprisings and such. That is what that says. As a result, you get a number of labor newspapers that start in Chicago and all over the country in the late 1800s because people are very aware of this bias. There are people on the street looking at the strikers, watching them be peaceful, watching police shoot them while they're peacefully demonstrating for an 8-hour workday. And as a result, the labor unions and the labor people start just publishing their own newspapers and reporting on these issues that affect them. Okay, I sped through that page. You're in luck. This is a great upheaval in 1877. You can watch my lecture on YouTube about strikes if you would like to know more about it. But essentially, in July of 1877, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad cuts wages for the second time in 8 months. Strikes begin in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and spread like wildfire to almost every single city across the country. The working people are with us, said one strike leader in Baltimore. They know what it's like to bring up a family on 90 cents a day, to run in debt at the stores until you cannot get trusted any longer. Children growing up sharp and fierce like wolves because they don't get enough to eat. The Chicago Workingsman Party calls a series of rallies in association with the 1877 strikes. And all they are asking for is to raise wages to $2 a day. That is $61 a day in today's money. That is what they are campaigning for. They work 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, and they're just saying, hey, can we get paid $61 for that labor? Brutal, right? Protesters clashed with police at the Battle of the Viaduct in Chicago at Halsted and 16th Street, Pilsen Pride. Things get especially bad. Estimates between 18 and 30 people die with up to 100 people injured at these start out peaceful demonstrations, again, campaigning for labor rights. Workers end up returning to their jobs. It's not a particularly successful strike, but it does prove that newspapers will report all kinds of horrendous things about strikers because, again, newspapers are capitalist enterprises. There's a couple of good ones on here just describing strikers. My favorite is from Alexandria, Virginia. The strikers are not... this far away. The strikers are not friends, but enemies of the poor. Like, what? That doesn't even make sense. And then in Chicago in 1886, we really find that labor agitation is common all across the country. 1886 is particularly active. There's almost 1,400 strikes in the country and 500,000 participants. It leads to expansive growth of labor unions like the Knights of Labor and leads to the Haymarket Affair. All they are campaigning for is the 8-hour workday. How many people here work 8 hours a day? Okay, guys. If you're working more than 8 hours a day, people died for that. Work 8. I'm so dead serious. Federal law in 1886 actually already mandated an 8-hour workday, but they failed to enforce their own law. In Illinois, employers would make you sign a waiver of the law as a condition of getting a job there. You had to be like, more than 8 hours, fine, or you couldn't work there. So what happens on May 1st, there's a variety of demonstrations in honor of May Day, a traditional labor holiday. And there's a number of peaceful demonstrations about fighting for the 8-hour workday. Unfortunately, on May 3rd, these kind of series of gatherings include police shooting at and killing 2 strikers at the McCormick Reaper plant in Little Village. In response, they publish this flyer they call, hey, come to Haymarket Square. We're going to have another demonstration because of police brutality, and all we're doing is trying to campaign for something that is very reasonable. This doesn't go well. May 4th of 1886, protesters gather. An unidentified person throws a bomb. We have never figured out definitively who throws the bomb. 7 police officers are killed, 4 to 8 civilians are killed, dozens of injuries, hundreds of activists are arrested, including 8 anarchists who published an anarchist German newspaper. They were not even at the scene of the crime. They just happened to be German anarchists. There's a huge sham trial. 7 of them are sentenced to die by hanging and are killed outside of our Cook County Court building. It's still there today. Police remember the Haymarket riots with positive terms. In fact, they have fought to protect the Haymarket Police Memorial statue, which I talked about last year in my talk on controversial Chicago art. They regard themselves as saviors of the law and order, while many people involved in unions and labor organizing condemn them as violent business sympathizers. This isn't the only, so here's an illustration of the Haymarket Affair. Here's some ways that people reported on the Haymarket Affair. Blood in the bomb butchery, Chicago's wild mobs. Just imagine, you're sitting there, and even the Chicago Tribune says 2 more dead heroes. I mean, the Chicago Tribune's always against the people. Sorry, Chicago Tribune. They won't even let me access their archive for free. But you can with the Chicago Public Library card, kids. This isn't even the only anarchist bombing of this era. 1920s, Wall Street is bombed in New York City by anarchists. They actually never catch them. Catch someone and call it their fault. April 15th of 1920, 2 Italian immigrants and anarchists, Sacco and Vanzetti, are found guilty of murdering 2 men to steal payroll at a factory. Socialists and radicals protest this sham trial in New York City. Bombs are set off in New York City and Philadelphia in solidarity for this horrific crime that is blamed on these people that people think are innocent and just a little anti-government. Here on the home front, we have everybody's favorite, George Pullman, 1894. Don't cheer George Pullman. He creates a picture-perfect factory town. Class, is it a picture-perfect factory town? Yeah, George Pullman was the boss, the landlord, and the mayor. So when he cuts wages and doesn't have rent, all of the workers in his idealistic factory town, get a little resentful, and things boil over. On May 11th of 1894, workers go on strike. A month later, a number of different labor unions get involved. They boycott handling Pullman cars and bring rail traffic in 27 states to a halt for a month. Violent altercations between protesters and authorities break out. Federal troops come to Chicago, and although the workers do not even have what is termed a successful strike in the 1890s, it so badly tarnishes the reputation of George Pullman that he has his casket encased in steel and concrete and buried in Graceland Cemetery so people cannot easily dig him up and piss on his body. I can't make this up. This isn't even the only George Pullman type. Oh, here's the Illinois National Guard at the Pullman strike. Here's how the Pullman strike is reported in newspapers. General tie-up, a failure. Yeah. And here's another favorite from Logan, Ohio. The real remedy of the strike evil is to restore silver to its ancient place in our financial system. Should I mention how mad people are about silver drama at this point in history? It's the crime of the century. If you remember one thing from this lecture tonight, please, for the love of God, be this fact, that silver is the real crime of the century. I didn't even look into what the silver drama is. Who cares? I did wear my silver bracelet. Okay. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, they're having some troubles with Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie, and Henry Clay Frick of the New York Museum. They, too, bust a bunch of strikes, have a deadly shootout with strikers. It's rough. We're not the only ones suffering from labor organized activities that get reported on as riots and sometimes are riots. But either way, the coverage of them in newspapers is definitely going to make someone in South Dakota think Chicago is a dangerous place. That's the point of me telling you all of this. Now, unions in general. Unions have to factor into our story of crime because, as I have already mentioned, mobsters tend to take over unions in the 1950s and 60s, misuse their pension funds, and turn those into ways of funding organized crime. But obviously, unions start out as a very good thing, and for many people today, they still are a very good thing. It is never an accident, by the way, when the economy is shit and labor conditions are bad, more people join unions. And when it evens out, less people join unions. And that pendulum is something that the United States has been on forever. This is an image here of when the Working Man's Party, a socialist organization, is established in Chicago in December of 1873. So enthused are 2,000 to 5,000 to 7,000 different Chicagoans that many people are not even able to get inside of Turner Hall to express their excitement to join a union. Here's a little map showing you that we have less people in unions today than we did at the time where labor abuses were the worst. But it is going back up slightly. As you might imagine, the United States at various points in time has not been a very big fan of labor unions, especially around 1919 or so, when the government kind of has to step in and stabilize some of the labor issues in America so that they can get the American machine producing guns for World War I. Generally, when the country is at war, everyone bands together and you kind of stop worrying about striking for a while because the government's like, hey, you guys, get the fuck along. We got troops to support. And this unfortunately results post-World War I in a huge, it's called the First Red Scare. There's a lot of characterizing of strikers as communists and socialists and all these dangerous people. This isn't common at this point in time. I've already told you about many anarchists that got arrested. This leads to the Palmer raids in 1919 and 1920, where federal police literally come in and just kind of round up anyone they think is an anarchist. Then the Depression comes. Guess what is very popular in the Depression? Labor unions, because you literally don't have a job. We get this grade A badass bitch, Frances fucking Perkins. Represent. Thank you for the fist bump. She's generally the author of the New Deal, although Franklin Roosevelt got most of the credit. She witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, the one that happened in New York City where they locked a bunch of garment workers in a building and let them burn to death. She witnesses this and becomes a tireless advocate for labor rights in America pretty much forever afterwards. So the Depression hits, union membership goes up. Things are looking pretty good by the mid-century. By the time we get to the post-World War, well, except for this. Okay, I'll hit it. This is the Memorial Day Massacre of 1937 in Chicago. This is the Little Steel Strike. Essentially, a smaller steel company didn't want to allow its members to unionize right after a larger steel company had successfully unionized, and the police decide to attack the protesters with tear gas and clubs. 10 people die as police fire into the unarmed crowd. Women and children are injured. And there is a federal investigation because officers claim they responded to the violence to protect the mill from communists. That fortunately does not work. But by the time we get to the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, it is cool to be part of a union, y'all. Mayor Jay Daley, here he is, marching with striking janitors in 1957. Here he is, using the mafia to get JFK elected. Unfortunately, it's not all good, guys. This is the section called racial tensions. Again, we're just creating a general atmosphere of all of the activity of violence happening in Chicago in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Literally, newspapers constantly are publishing news about some strike or violent uprising or unviolent uprising that became violent, or some sort of riot, or some sort of disagreement, or some sort of gunfight. That damn Associated Press that our homies started for us really is just spreading all of this news all over the United States. And yeah, again, if you're living in rural Kansas, you're reading newspapers that say riot sweeps Chicago and going, oh shit. And this is published by the Chicago Defender, the black newspaper. I mean, this is still going to make somebody reading this somewhere else think that we are a dangerous city. Now, this specific paper refers to the 1919 Red Summer. It was actually a series of 25 different race riots that happened all over the United States. Here are some images from what happened here in Chicago. Some very powerful imagery comes from the 1919 documentation. It's pretty interesting to look at. Here's National Guardsmen in Chicago in 1919. Okay, 100 years later, they have better uniforms. 1919 is such a violent summer. It is not just Chicago that is struggling with race riots, although ours is the worst. Ours kicks off because on July 27th of 1919, a black child dares to drift a little bit too close to the white beach. And this results in the majority of the Black Belt being burned down, injuring over 500 people, killing 38, and leaving many black homes and businesses destroyed. It was the white people doing it. Also, papers like the New York Times in July of 1919 associate the race riots with propaganda from left-wing socialists, and that is the New York Times. It's not good to be a black person in Chicago in most of history. Now, as we get away from 1919, as we get into the 1950s, we have Emmett Till. As we get into the mid-century, we also have urban renewal. Now, Mandy is going to give an incredible talk on urban renewal later this lecture series. But essentially, the issue with urban renewal is it clears the way for redlining. And these were maps that regular-ass people were hired by the government to create in the 1930s as a way of creating jobs for Americans. They survey neighborhoods. They're just regular old racists surveying neighborhoods saying, this one has too many black people, and coloring it red on the map. Which means that you couldn't get a mortgage in that part of the city for, 50 years. As you might expect, if you're just a young, let's say, white and non-racist family, if you need a mortgage to buy a house, your options, as you can see from this map, are Winnetka. Woo-woo! Nowhere in the city can you get a loan. So this phenomenon of white flight, middle-class flight, happens all throughout the mid-century, decimating the urban core of cities all across the United States. I encourage you to look up something called mapping inequality. You can look at any state in the United States and look at really high-res scans of these maps, showing you what your neighborhood was called at this point in time. These maps become a gateway for massive clear-cutting of the city. I've included some pictures of urban blight here for you. Do you notice how it looks kind of fun? Yeah, that's intentional. Then we just tear down big sections of these slums and build fresh, modern, crime-free, perfect, beautiful utopias of segregated public housing. And expressways, so you can get from Winnetka to Chicago quicker, and you don't even have to get out of your car and deal with the riffraff. Unfortunately, public housing doesn't work in the way that we build it here. Chicago, in a lot of ways, had the best intentions, except for the whole segregated thing. They really did incorporate a lot of ideals of Le Corbusier and influential architects of the mid-century era. They wanted to build something they thought was better than crowded tenement housing. And the reality is, not a lot of cities were building public housing. So we were kind of our own guinea pig, and we just kind of fucking went for it. And it turned out to be a horrid idea. But in some ways, we had the right intentions. Unfortunately, these sorts of Tower of a Park designs just concentrated housing and some parkland. But the thing that makes this better, makes these thriving neighborhoods better, is that they're walkable. There's businesses and movie theaters and housing and small businesses and markets and bars and clubs and places to play policy and all kinds of music venues and thriving life in these old neighborhoods. And they're run down, and there's definitely some housing code violations, and there's some dirt streets. But ultimately, these are vibrant, diverse places to live, and when you replace them with these giant towers in a park, there's nowhere to work. There's no great public transit. You gotta walk a mile to get out of one of these things just to get to your job, which you can't even walk to anymore because they took out half of the Green Line. These were doomed to fail. They were built exclusively in the Black Belt of Chicago and generated lawsuits from the NAACP and are now pretty much all gone. We're not, okay, but I had to include a picture of my badass bitch here, Mayor Jane Byrne, the original Chicago woman mayor to not get enough credit. Shout out my girl Lori. She had her problems, but she ain't Brandon Johnson. Okay, so this is Mayor Jane Byrne. She, as sort of a publicity stunt, moved into Cabrini Green for like a month and lived in an apartment there. And people were like, this is a publicity stunt. You're not actually doing anything to fix any of the problems. But holy fuck, was it ballsy. It is ballsy in a way that none of our male mayors would have gone with a 10-foot pole into this fucking housing project. And Jane Byrne strolled her white ass in there and was like, I'm moving in. It's such a power move, and it's so insane that I think it's low-key iconic. And every time I drive through her namesake interchange and curse because I've accidentally gone north instead of south, I think to myself, Jane Byrne. She was low-key a badass bitch. There's a picture of her smoking next to Bozo the Clown. She's Jane Byrne. Didn't get enough credit. Only served one term. Women mayors are only allowed to serve one term in Chicago. That's unwritten, though. Regardless, turns out clearing all those slums wasn't a good idea, and building this in their place, one would argue they're not even slums. Gang violence, unemployment, and unlivable conditions become very prevalent in public high-rise communities across the country. Crime explodes so exponentially in Chicago Housing Authority high-rise towers that from 1989 to 1999, for a period of 10 years, the city ran its own entire police unit devoted to trying to police some of this crime. And these were incredibly effective buildings. The same reason Al Capone holed up in the Lexington Hotel. With distance from the ground floor, you gain power as a gangster. What they would do in a lot of the public housing buildings, and what Al Capone did at the Lexington Hotel, was block staircases, disable elevators, and control means and methods to get up to the upper floor, so that by the time the cops got to that upper floor on the 13th floor, you were scrabbled down a secret passageway built and tunneled through holes in the wall like the little nasty rat you are. And the sad thing is, people look at the gangsters that proliferated in Cabrini Green and they go, oh, horrible, and they make Gangland episodes about them, and then they get tattoos of Al Capone, who did the exact same thing while white. That's part of my rant about Al Capone. Nancy wasn't a fan. South Bronx, New York, 1980 has just the same problems as we do. Has anybody seen The Wire? That's about Baltimore's same problem. Again, the worst crime rates Chicago or most United States cities have ever seen occurred during these periods of massive economic disenfranchisement of our urban cores. That is when crime was worse in all of our cities, in Chicago, in New York, in Baltimore, in Philadelphia, and every single U.S. city that you can name, that you can find a mapping inequality redlining map of. This happened. And that is because we stripped our urban cores of people that were middle class and we just let them rot. And yeah, turns out that causes crime. Who knew? Finally, remember our last section here, is about political activism, because at the end of the day, it's not just labor activism happening in Chicago. We also have, in the 1960s, a number of political protests. Remember how I said our home dog at the Chicago Police Department, Mr. Wilson, retired in 1967. I really wish that he would have stayed in the position for just one more year, because 1968 is a crazy time in Chicago. It is the radical 60s everywhere. Civil rights movement, Vietnam War protests, equal pay movement, and the summer of love are sweeping the nation. That's right, your grandparents are getting nasty at Woodstock. Coincided with a large-scale migration of black folks from the South, where they were being lynched, like Emmett Till, up here to these somewhat safer northern cities like Chicago. This creates a number of housing and racially driven housing tensions in neighborhoods across Chicago and across cities all over the United States. It also, again, coincides with a lot of neglect and police brutality. Chicago in 1968, there are a variety of different protests that occur. After MLK is assassinated, there are a number of riots that occur all over the United States. People are angry, and can you blame them? Over 100 major U.S. cities experienced disturbances resulting in $50 million of damage. In Chicago, the West Side has literally never recovered. On April 4th, 48 hours of rioting left 11 dead, 48 wounded by police, 90 policemen injured, 2,000 people arrested, and 1,000 people left homeless, as 3 miles of East Garfield Park and West Garfield Park were ultimately left in a state of rubble. There are 120 fires and 210 buildings damaged, totaling $10 million worth of destruction. People report on this, as you might imagine. Later in 1968, we have the Democratic National Convention, which you can learn all about in a fantastic lecture given by Mandy Crypt, available on our YouTube. Can you guys tell I recently uploaded all of our videos to YouTube? There is another violent clash between protesters and the police at the Chicago Democratic National Convention of August 1968. This is also super well publicized. It's on TV. There's these pictures published in newspapers all around the country. There's all this evidence of people, just innocent protesters, being beaten senseless with clubs by Daley's police. And the Chicago Sun-Times reports it as National Guard versus hippies at the Conrad Hilton. Which, Chicago Sun-Times is one of those petty papers. You can't blame them, but... this is theoretically you pay more for racist news from the New York Times, and you pay less for hilarious news from the Chicago Sun-Times. And then, because at the end of the day, the main takeaway you should take away from this section is that rich people control the media, and the media does not like to report on the working class and the everyday man rising up and doing peaceful demonstrations over the wealth inequity and labor abuses of the ruling class. If you protest, you have to trust that the news media is going to write an incredibly biased story about the protests that you attended. They are going to overhype the crime, and that has been true in Chicago since the literal 1800s, and it's not going to change. So don't necessarily trust the news. Don't necessarily trust things. Always question, always cross-verify. This presentation was brought to you by me looking at sources from 2 different angles and being like, lol. Because the only way that you can find the truth in history is to look for what 2 different accounts from 2 different points of view said about the same incident. And the truth is usually somewhere in the middle. I'll close out this section by talking about the Rainbow Coalition, Black Panthers and Young Lords, plus poor white folks from Appalachia, known as the Young Patriots, sporting Confederate flags on their denim vests, all teamed up in Uptown, participating in the same labor rights organizations, community activism, and protest. They formed the Rainbow Coalition in 1969 thanks to the uniting work of Fred Hampton, a great movie you can check out, Judas and the Black Messiah. Unfortunately, didn't film any of it in Chicago, and it's very obvious. Advocating against police brutality and for social programs that benefited the everyday person living in these decimated urban cores, asking for things like, please don't beat us up and let our children go to kindergarten. As a result, the FBI murdered Fred Hampton in 1969. Chicago's worst crime of all, the working class fighting for better conditions. All right, I'm almost done, I swear to God. How do we stack up today? Catching strays since the 1880s, you guys. I had a fun time putting this together. This is just a selection of news articles that just call Chicago comically evil at many points in history, from a carnival of crime in Chicago to a home of criminals in Laredo, Texas, to Chicago jewel thieves, shout out to Adam for this screenshot here from Madison, Wisconsin, which claims apprehended 2 days later, it turned out to be Chicago hoodlums, proving that Chicago has always been the same. Stealing jewels. And fighting back ever since. Here's a little shout out to my boy Brandon Johnson for all his failings. He too denies that Chicago is crime center. Chicagoans have been posting and publishing editorials and sending out, along with the Associated Press News, all kinds of defenses for their crime since the very beginning. One of the things that I really enjoy is Potter Palmer being asked about crime in Chicago in 1893 and him being like, come on now. I just love Potter Palmer and I are fighting the same fucking fight. James Adams and I are fighting the same fucking fight. Just publicizing as much news as we can, being like, you guys, it's seriously not that bad. Look at the statistics. Let's look at those statistics. You see how we're way fucking down? You see that big high point? That was the 80s and 90s, you guys. You see how 1920 is like a quarter of it? It just got better press. Straight up. Cities with the highest homicide rates in 2024. Tag yourself. We're 10 out of cities with more than 100,000 people. Consistently throughout most of Chicago and United States history, we have been, like I said, middle of the pack to not at all that bad. Our city's worst years for crime were between 1982 and 1998. Homicides in Chicago reached their peak at 1992 at a homicide rate of 32. Again, we have about half of that today. This was comparable to other cities of the same size at the same time. New York boasted a murder rate of 31 per 100,000 just 2 years later, or just 2 years prior in 1990. So we are no worse than New York or any other major metropolis at our worst period in history in the 1990s. Contrary to everyone's horror at the antics of Al Capone, this period is actually the worst. And at no point between 1985 and today did Chicago have even close to the worst murder rate in the country. Washington, D.C., New Orleans, and Detroit all topped the list multiple times, with New Orleans post-Katrina years at recording almost 95 homicides per 100,000 people, are the worst rates of United States crime in a major city ever studied. How many of you guys were alive for Hurricane Katrina? You remember the worst crime in America. It was not Al Capone. With 15.8 murders per 100,000 people in 2023, we came in 17th place after New Orleans, Memphis, St. Louis, Baltimore, D.C., Birmingham, Philly, Kansas City, Richmond, Indianapolis, Milwaukee, Louisiana, Louisville, Cleveland, Detroit, Atlanta, and Norfolk, Virginia. Chicago marked the lowest annual number of homicides in 2025 since 1965. And it is not because federal troops were sent in to solve a problem that is systemic and unable to be solved with the presence of federal troops. Our homicide rate this year was, again, a shocking low of 14.6. Most cities in the United States recorded low homicide rates this year. And even if we look at crime rates, the thing is like once we even start including things not just murder but like robbery and assault, in 2024 we didn't even crack the top 10. By the numbers for overall crime, Memphis is the worst city in America. Portland, Detroit, Seattle, Baltimore, Denver, Nashville, Philadelphia, Houston, and San Antonio, all much worse for overall crime. In virtually every category, New York City is safer than Chicago, despite having a larger population. But New York City has a much worse opioid problem. Chicago's opioid problem is actually much better under control than most of our peer cities in the United States. And yet, as these newspaper articles show you, Chicago forever has been catching strays. We have been recorded as being one of the wickedest cities forever and ever and ever. This poll, I think, is very interesting. In 2014, 53% of Americans considered Chicago unsafe, the worst reputation of any major city, despite being, and say it with me, middle of the pack. All right. Conclusion. I love this pig. Hold on. Shot a beer for me. Chicago is not the most dangerous city in America. For its entire history, it has always ranked alongside or below its peers. In the early days, we were the size of East Coast cities and shared their same problems of industrialization, conflicting cultures, and scale. But we were younger and Western with a frontier spirit, generating a distinct style of opportunistic crime, deviant attitudes, corruption, and unsophistication. Our government became enmeshed with our criminals. We became a transportation and information hub with our problems reaching the ears of everyone nationwide and capturing the world's attention, something we often actively sought out by, publishing books that are like, you want to see some prostitutes in Chicago? I'll tell you where. Our people have been historic rabble-rousers, willing to fight for radical ideas of democracy and equality. Our rich people buried themselves in cement because they knew how powerful our people could be when they were angry. We brought our reputation upon ourselves. We earned it, and we asked for the world's attention. But some of this history is worth being proud of. We pushed the boundaries of polite society with our tireless campaigns for racial justice, fair wages, and the right to be a little taboo sometimes. Beer is fun, and women should be able to show off their ankles in peace. I said it. And some of this history is something we should be ashamed of and work hard to avoid repeating. Corrupt, racist, rich mobsters running your city for decades is nothing to be proud of. Gangster crime is not cool to glamorize, even if they're wearing fedoras and pinstripes. Stop getting tattoos of Al Capone. But at the end of the day, much of the reporting then and now has been unfair, overdramatic, and designed to sell newspapers. What we have gone through has been much the same as what cities and towns across our country and across the world have experienced and continue to fight. Not to mention, tourists have always been the biggest consumers of slumming activities, from gangster tours to judging harshly from afar and satisfying their confirmation bias while visiting. By, for instance, purchasing Chicago by Night and finding out where they keep all the ladies at. So to all the haters, I say this. Get off your damn high horse. You're welcome for your 8-hour workday. Stay away from my city if it scares you. Your ignorance means you'll never get to taste our incredible food. And I'm happy to have less competition over our nation's largest reserve of fresh water. And if you're frightened by the crime, you'll never survive our most common form of actual abject terror. the experience of carrying your groceries home from the Jewels in negative 13-degree weather with lake effect wind chill. Go home, Chicago is for the tough.